here's my thing. Okay, so we'll start with all sorts of confessions, personal confessions. I have always had an allergy to postmodernism, and that allergy probably led to my not appreciating Rav Shagar, because Rav Shagar seemed to be defending postmodernism, and I largely saw myself as as William F. Buckley said about the 20th century in general. I saw myself standing athwart history, shouting "Stop!" Right, in terms of postmodernism, and so I never really got Rav Shagar. I was looking about for something completely different to do at the end of this series of shiurim, after a week of doing nothing but pure halacha, and so I thought that it would be interesting for the first time to try and engage with Rav Shagar. The reason I thought it'd be interesting is because our whole perception of reality, what the nature of reality is, and what the importance of certain kinds of reality is, I think have been affected, or at least it's possibly being affected by the way in which we live virtually. Our social lives are virtual in a way they've never been before. We're kind of living in a science fiction experiment, right? You can imagine somebody 30 years ago, right, imagining a plague world in which people are still alive physically, but they never interact with each other except virtually. There is such a world in Asimov's robot series. The planet Aurora is a planet, right, where people live, but they live in isolated spaces and they only communicate with each other by hologram or through robots. So it struck me as a fascinating experiment in terms of how we relate to certain kind of postmodern ideas, that we've actually gotten to live that world now. So that's one thing. Now that plays out for somebody who lives primarily right now intellectually in the halachic world, at least for this week. The constant shaila that comes up is, what about creating various kinds of halachic sirufim, halachic groupings through Zoom? And now a lot of the objections to it, that when people get into the conversation, they're really good objections, is that the technology isn't good enough yet. Like, for example, my friends on listservs who are trying to organize group singing say that there really isn't a video conferencing program good enough yet to have people sing in unison. Every online singing group sounds like a shul with poor talent. The people in back aren't singing together. The people in front, right? Everything is offbeat. Um, but I think that we have to face the reality that the technology will get better, and probably that this is not the last. Unfortunately, there's no reason to assume this is the last time that we're going to engage in this kind of reaction to a possible pandemic. Um, and so we really need to address the question fundamentally. And as you expect, there are people in the halachic community who are celebrating. Now we can finally have Zoom Minyanim, and there are people who are fighting desperately. Not as many as I would have thought. I would say that there's an issue that I have raised with a number of people who are in favor of Zoom Minyanim, which is the importance of 3 dimensions. We don't have holograms yet, and it's really interesting to me that people are willing to go to Zoom without 3-dimensionality, which seems to me to undermine a lot of past literature about the glory of the human form. Although, test case, somebody has now sent me a tshuva I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but so far I've only heard of one tshuva about combinations to minyan involving mirrors, which are also 2-dimensional projections of 3-dimensional people. That's one thing. I want to integrate into the conversation the question of how the experience of socializing virtually has affected our sense of it, and whether that's just because limitations of technology, if there are in fact such a sense, or not. Let's say, for example, one model that rabbis tell me about is possible that that virtual gatherings work really well for Talmud Torah and don't work well for tefillah. And the question of that's an accident of the technology or something essential about it, and talked about maybe we can reify that halachically and say that you can create a minyan for a siyum, but not a minyan for davening and things like that. And another possibility is that in terms of community, in the sense of shared spiritual space, it works really well for people who don't usually go to minyan, but not as well for people who have an experience of minyan that's central and compare it to. So I want to put those out there. Okay, so in preparing for this year, I reread, and I want to thank Steve Gottlieb for sending me the copy of the article, Rav Shagar's famous essay on which he describes Neo of the movie The Matrix as a messianic figure, and hackers in general as messianic figures. So a couple of things happened to me when I read this. One was that I realized that Rav Shagar was no longer cool in the same way he had been. And the experience I want to compare this to is I remember years ago, my friend Rav Yitzchak Blau is Rosh Hashiva Baraita now, and his wife were teaching in Frisch, and they went to a Simon and Garfunkel reunion concert. I believe that one of the ones in Central Park, and they went in and talked and told their classes about this, and expecting like they would be the coolest teachers in the world. And their classes looked at them like they were 150 years old. Simon and Garfunkel. Right? That's what you think is cool. So my 20-year-olds and 13-year-old reacted that way to understand to hearing that I was reading an essay about the Matrix. And that made it better for me. Right? That made me capable of dealing with a Shagar because I wasn't struggling with the cool new thing. I was what I was doing was reading, a thinker who could be contextualized in the light of history, and I guess it made me less worried about by surrendering to postmodernism if I take him really seriously. Right, so that's one thing, and then possibly as a result of not being bothered, right, not being bothered by that, I have to say that the essay was brilliant. It was a marvelously brilliant essay. It was a beautiful. It made me think that I should go back and study Rav Nachman. If Rav Nachman's stories are really like that, right? Then that I'm missing a lot. So what I want to do. All right. So now I have two kinds. One is the question of whether the nature of whether our perception of reality and the importance of certain kinds of reality or not. I would put it in stark terms, whether our perception of the value of being embodied has changed as a result of the coronavirus epidemic. Whether because that I think it might be fair to say like that part of the whole issue underlying whether you see reality as a prison or reality as a park is whether you feel yourself imprisoned in your body or you feel yourself living through your body, and that's a big deal of what the Matrix is about, and that's a big deal, right? And I think that Rav Shagar talks about that. So I want to tell the Rav Nachman story the way I understand Rav Shagar to be telling it, and then I'll ask Rav Mayan to correct any mistakes I've made. You can interject in the middle and correct any mistakes I make or contextualize it. Is he really? I'm less interested for this week in whether he's properly conveying Rav Nachman, and the way I have to acknowledge that that Alan Brill has argued repeatedly that Rav Shagar offers what we would call, I guess, idiosyncratic interpretations of many of the people he cites in the philosophic world. And so, he also cites Derrida here, and I'm not going to evaluate whether he's correctly presenting Derrida or not. The whole notion of correctly presenting Derrida, of course, is paradoxical. Right? It's cheating. I love talking about this. That years ago, a friend of mine who was a determinist, and I told him that it's kind of dark. I said, I don't really understand how people live as determinists as opposed to believing in free will. I think if I were a determinist, I would, I think I'd understand why determinists don't commit suicide. Life is pointless. And he said, well, you're right, but that's just the way it is. Right? So the same notion, right? Derrida was asked the same question about why you write, right? If you believe communication is impossible, and his answer was, I'm a determinist. Right, so that's I'm not going to bother if we properly understand properly conveying Derrida or not. But I want to try and present what I got out of this essay and his perception of and why he presents hackers as messianic. And I think that we're more capable of evaluating that in an age when hackers are no longer cool and no longer this mythical figure. Hackers are more people who are involved in creating false facts, right? And so our celebration of the capacities of hackers to create alternate reality, I think, will be much more ambivalent and much more nuanced than it might have been when Rav Shagar wrote. And then I want to compare the way in which his messianic figure relates to reality, and in a sense, creates a realm different than what is usually described of as reality, with the way the Ish Halacha does a very similar thing. And I want to talk about, and I want to learn about the advantages and disadvantages and relationship among them
God.
of all among those two perceptions. Okay, so let's start by telling the story. Um, here's the story as I understand it. There is a king, and the king believes himself to be the least worried person in the world. Right, or actually, probably I think the best way to frame it is the most carefree person in the world. It's probably the best way. But there's an inherent paradox in believing yourself to be the most carefree person in the world, because if you're conscious of being the most carefree person in the world, then you're already worried about, right? You're not just living in the moment and experiencing your carefreeness. You're already worried about somebody else there being more carefree, being more carefree than you. And this king, in fact, is worried about that, right? This king is worried that there might be somebody in the world more carefree than he, which is obvious who that person would be, which would be the person who isn't worried about there's being someone more carefree than he is. And just so we can have some traditional Torah at the very outset, there is a Gemara. I forgot, I didn't look it up. I think it's in Avodah Zarah, in which Rava sends a korban to a figure known as Bar Sheshach. Bar Sheshach is probably, right, based on Yirmiyah, it's probably an Atbash for Bavel. So that tells you that this interplay between Rava and Bar Sheshach is really a meeting between Jewish and Babylonian culture. And at some point in that, and he finds Bar Sheshach, disporting himself in as a voluptuary. He's in a bathtub filled with rose petals, and a bunch of let's say women of ill repute are cavorting in the bathtub with him. And Bar Sheshach says to Rava, "Do you have any as beautiful as these in your heaven?" And Rava's response is that ours are more beautiful than yours. And the question is, in what way they're more beautiful? So Rava says, because we don't have to worry about the authority of the government. And Bar Sheshach says, what? Right, we don't have to worry. Right, we don't have to worry about Shubin Malchios. And Bar Sheshach says, what? I don't have to worry about Shubin Malchios. And at that moment, the messenger comes from the king and pulls Bar Sheshach out of his rose tub filled bathtub. Now, what's really going on, I think, is that what you have here is the position Ein ben olam hazeh limos hamashiach or l'olam haba ela shibud malchios bilvad. Right, that there's the notion of being free from restriction. Right, Rava says, right, is really the only kind of freedom that matters. And as long as you're in any kind of hierarchy, right, it's not. That's right. That's a fascinating notion. Nothing else matters. All that matters is the freedom from Shibud Malchios, and any illusion you have in this world that you have freedom is false, because there's always Shibud Malchios in this world. So I think that's part of what's going on here in terms of in terms of this king, right, and the notion that that you can be more carefree than anyone else. Okay, this king goes out and discovers somebody, an ordinary person, and who is having a solitary party with himself, playing musical instruments and eating and singing. And this person, it seems to the king, is likely more carefree than he is. So reacts the only way people can, if you're feeling insecure about your own condition, he reacts by trying to destroy this person's carefreeness, by imposing cares on them. And everything he does fails, because no matter what he does to try and make this person unhappy, right, he asks them, and the person tells them they live as a kind of fixer of all things, and they always get enough money as a fixer of all things. And no matter what the king does to try and destroy their employment, and make sure they don't have enough money to run the nightly party that makes them happy, they always find a way to transform it. The last thing the person does is, ironically, is to support themselves by becoming a soldier in the king's army. But they're not quite an honest soldier, because what they do is they take the blade off their sword and polish it, and they sell the metal, and with that, right, and he replaces it with a wooden painting essentially, of a sword which he affixes to his sword blade, so that he can go on pretending to be a soldier while he has his party at night with the money from selling whatever the special metal is that his sword is made out of. The king catches on to this and attempts to expose him by ordering him to act as executioner that night with his sword. The soldier protests that he's never done anything like killed anybody in his life. He doesn't want to act as an executioner. So there's a whole separate conversation about using morals in order to protect your immorality. Right? He claims he has pangs of conscience, even though he's acting as a thief. The king calls him on it. So what the soldier finally does is he prays he prays out loud that if the king is going to force him to act as executioner, may his sword blade turn to wood. And of course, he pulls out his sword, and guess what? It's wood. And now the king knows all right. The king put him in this trick because the king caught him. But instead of the king exposing him, the king laughs, and everything ends up happily. The king apparently is no longer worried about somebody being more carefree than he is, and supports right now. Why that is, that's the part that Rav Shagar doesn't really deal with. So Rav Shagar argues that in this story of Nachman, which he says is is a messianic background because it's told 2 weeks after the death of Nachman's son, whom he harbored messianic hopes for. So it's told in a time of great despair, and as an expression of faith. So Rav Shagar says that the king is God. He does not, in the context of this interpretation, so far as I know, address the question of why God is insecure. Well, that seems to me like a profound theological issue with this interpretation, or at least profound theological question regarding this interpretation. And the soldier is the tzaddik, right? And the metaphor of the blade is really all religious ritual, but essentially prayer. And here's the underlying claim. It says, so what is prayer? So we discover in the story, prayer is praying for something that is already true, but that everyone believes to be false. Right? Prayer is praying that your sword, which is in fact already wood, will become wood. And then it looks like your prayer came true, but actually all your prayer did was acknowledge the reality as it was. Yes, right. Yeah.
One important detail from the story that I think is relevant to what you're saying right now is that because, again, the king had all these different plots to try to stop him from getting money to be able to afford his feast. So one of his things was he made sure that as the soldier, he wouldn't get paid. That's why he had to sell the medal. But the guy told him, listen, I can pay you double wages tomorrow, but today I have very strict orders. I can't pay you. So, I guess I'm pointing out, first of all, he was planning on actually buying the medal back from the pawn shop the next day once he got the money. So he didn't just pawn it and have no plans.
So that's
and I think that relates to what you're saying now about he has this future thing that he's really basing his security and his happiness on. Is that, after all, it wasn't just based on nothing. The guy told him he would pay him double wages tomorrow. So he was relying on that.
That's interesting. I don't think Rav Shagar mentions that.
Oh, yeah?
When he tells the story, right? So I have to go back, I'm more likely to skip things in Hebrew than in English, and I read it in Hebrew.
So maybe he summarizes the story, yeah.
But I think when he retells the story, he leaves it out, and that might matter, right? That might be one of Rabbi Brill's.
I mean, yeah, in the original story, which, by the way, was only published in 1905. There's a whole other thing about when the story was first published and what are the manuscript history of the story. But at any rate, in the story also, the way the king finds out is because he keeps going incognito and meeting this guy who has no idea he's the king. So he actually goes into his house and he says, and he sees him again having a feast and being happy. And he goes in again and he says, oh, what's going on? And he tells him, well, they wouldn't pay me today, but it'll pay me tomorrow. So I pawned the medal, but I'm going to buy it back tomorrow. The king didn't even figure anything out. He went in and the guy told him the whole Misa. That's how the king knew.
So that's interesting. I think Rav Shagar includes the king going in every day, but I don't think he mentions this detail. Okay, so that has to be checked afterwards. It was just too big to put it on the Makorot, so I didn't put the whole story on the Makorot. Okay, so now the question, right? So in Rav Shagar's world, what prayer does is prayer enables the fiction to be regarded as reality. Right? The sword is right. He has a painted wooden sword, and he prays he prays that what everyone else believes is a metal sword will turn into a wooden sword, and so when it turns out to be a wooden sword, everyone says, right, look, a miracle happened, but he knows that a miracle didn't happen at all, right? He knows that he's just acknowledging, right? He's just acknowledging the reality. So now, I think this is what Rav Shagar does with it. I think what Shagar says is the following. What he says, I'll say the key quote is, he says that prayer is answered only when it's a joke. Right? This whole story is a joke, right? What the guy is doing, right? It's a very serious context. He's trying to avoid executing somebody, but fundamentally, what he's doing is making a joke, right? He's setting up this whole scheme so that people will believe that his sword is currently a sword, even though the king knows the reality, and he's making everyone perceive it. So Rav Shagar argues that is a fundamental element of prayer, and here's how I understand his argument about prayer. He says is that I'm going to try and make sure I formulate this right. What he says is that the person who truly prays understands that this world is an illusion, and so the desire to want something to happen in this world is really just a desire, right? Is really just a desire for painted swords. It's not really, right? There's really nothing about this world that is real, and if you truly pray, then you understand that this world is an illusion. And that's where he brings in the Matrix, right? Where the character Neo in the Matrix is living in a world that appears deterministic, right? And that's part of the illusion for Rav Shagar of this world, is that we live in a world that appears deterministic. And so it seems like, right, there are right, everything happens because something happened before, and all the science is true. And the only thing, right, and you can't really, he thinks, ask for miracles in the context of a deterministic world. That's a contradiction, right? What you can do is, right, what you can do is expose the illusion and say there is no determinism in this world. All the appearances of this world are fake. That's what miracles really do, right? Miracles say that there's no miracles say there's really no restriction on what should happen next. There's no determinism. There's no causality. The world, right? The world is right. The world is whatever God wants it to be. And so now the mashal, or the mashal is in the Matrix that human beings, as you find out at the end of the movie, I'm hoping I'm not killing this for people. Human beings have been captured by aliens, and we all live in a completely virtual world, and therefore our conceptions of the possible are completely restricted by the rules of this virtual world. Now, the rules of the virtual world are not exactly the same as the rules of the physical world, right? And the more skilled programmers are capable of making themselves live in this virtual world, as avatars. They can have superpowers, they can have all sorts of things like that, but they're still bound by the rules of this world. They're right? And then comes along Neo, and Neo is the one who realizes that there are no rules in this world because it's not real. Right? This whole world is an illusion, and so whatever he conceives of can happen. Right? Can happen in this world. So Rav Shagar says, okay, so Neo, right? He describes as the hacker, right? The person who understands that there are no rules to the virtual universe, is the Messiah, who will free us all, and right, who will make us all recognize that the physical deterministic world that we live in, which we might also extend to our spiritual realities, and believe that what we can do next is solely a function of what we could do yesterday, as opposed to believing that we have absolute freedom to recreate ourselves. So in regards to that, that's ultimately what the reason that postmodernism, as he understands it, is a profoundly religious thing. And he makes it very clear point at the end of the essay, says there are people who think that postmodernism can lead to religious revival because they think that people will be terrified of complete freedom. And what postmodernism has done is enable us to believe that as we now know, we have a darker vision of it, that that there's no truth other than that which is constructed by mass belief. He says that's a terrible way to construct religion. Religion shouldn't be constructed out of fear of the lack of any fixed points. Religion should be constructed in celebration of the lack of fixed points, because true religious belief is the realization that there is no causality in the world, because the world itself doesn't really matter. The world is just an illusion. And if you truly believe in God, then it's true. God can save you. God can send a miracle. But all sending a miracle is getting people to recognize that the sword was really painted wood all along. It doesn't actually change anything, because there is nothing. The only world that matters is the spiritual world. That's my presentation of Shagar's position. So now I'll take Ramaya. What do you have any comment in regard to that?
So I don't know the essay by Rav Shagar that you're referring to right now inside, so I can't assess that. I think there's a lot of, I wouldn't read the Reb Nachman story in that way. I mean, I know you said that wasn't, you're not being done on that point, but yeah, I'm thinking more. I'm just going to think more about what you said right now.
Okay, so I'll push other people. Right, I know that we got Rafi. You were raising your hand. Yeah, go ahead, Rafi, because you find Rav Shagar attractive, I think, right? That's
I like Rav Shagar.
Good, and I know, like, when I go to Malay Gilboa, there's the broken luchos, or every makom in Malay Gilboa.
Oh, wow.
The presentation of it not being cool is probably a slur on a whole Orthodox subculture. So go ahead, tell me what you like about this, Rafi, and where I got it wrong.
Oh no, I'm not here to criticize at all. I actually just wanted to ask you a question, which was, sure. Where you said how the realization within prayer of understanding that really the world is an illusion, and I was thinking about how does that play a role in terms of the question of my sense of the world being deterministic, being related to sort of whether or not being sort of related to my actions, whereas sort of the illusion sense, the sense of illusion and sort of dissonance is sort of related to the fact that in a sense I still have free will in my mind, or is it beyond that sort of capacities, you have to be really skilled to know that you have free will?
So let me I'll try and take that in a couple of ways. I think that what he's saying, and again, this is I think there are some thinkers, I usually use Ayn Rand as an example, which will raise all your hackers, who read one essay and think they know everything about a whole thing about a thinker, and that doesn't always work. You have to have context. Say about myself that was an important lesson for me. That once after Rav Schechter gave a shir on Eruvin, I went up to him, and he presented certain diagrams, and I went up to him and I said, "But Rebbe, there's a much simpler explanation of all those diagrams." And he listened to me, and he said, "I said Rav Schechter, right?" And he said, "You're right. That's a better explanation of those pictures. But the Chazon Ish has a lot of pictures." I didn't know the other picture, right? So that, it was a weakness in the shir, in that the shir gave it as if you had all the evidence, and that was enough. But on the other hand, you got to know that the Chazon Ish has lots of pictures. So so for me to talk about Rav Shagar, when my familiarity with his larger works is minimal, is scary. But here's what I think, that if I were just taking this essay, what I would say is, he thinks that you have a great deal more freedom than you generally do. But he might think that you're free. He might think, now this would be putting him in the context of Tzedakah Cohen and that whole school, which might just be unfairly putting together all the people who are popular nowadays when they didn't see themselves as related to each other in any way. Rav Tzadok, the one idea I know from Rav Tzadok, right, also a dangerous thing, is that there is no free will in your physical choices. The only free will is in your mind. Right? So that's Rav Tzadok. Right? So if you think that the physical world is an illusion, it makes sense to say, right, that the notion that your choices in the real world are what matter is not is false. All that matters are your choices in the world of the spirit. Okay, right. Does someone else want to say something? Okay, I don't.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I was sort of just asking, what do you think? to me it's interesting to think about like the distinction between sort of like our psychological choices and how that has to do with prayer versus like what we think of as our physical choices.
So I think a really interesting question to ask here is whether we wish to perceive ourselves as being as free as, let's say, Rav Nachman, as I'm arguing Rav Nachman wants us to see ourselves. Is that a spiritual good necessarily or not? So I'll tell you the way I often think about this. Chesterton, in the first, I think it's in the first of the second volume of the Father Brown stories. Chesterton talks about it. What I think believe is a real Catholic religious exercise, which has always struck me as very powerful and also terrifying. I'm not sure it's right. So they ask Father Brown. For those who don't know, Father Brown is a Catholic priest who functions as a detective. How is it right now? They're asking what's your secret now that he's published, at least one major volume of short stories solving all these issues. What's your secret? And what he says is, what I do is I imagine myself in the place of the thief. And this is it's really exercise I engage in. I imagine myself in the place of the thief till I get to the point where the only difference between me and the thief or the murder, whatever it is free choice. And the choice, right? And the thief the thief uses bechira that way, and I use my bechira this way. But now I can understand exactly what he's doing, right? Because I can think exactly like him. And the only thing at the end is I make that bechira. And the point of that exercise for Chesterton was for everyone to recognize that they are really no different than the sinner, except for the choice they made in that moment. Right? And the counter exercise is to say that the whole goal of a spiritual life is to build up habits. Right? I think that you might see Rav Dessler, right, arguing that way, right? The point is to move your, right? Everyone has a nekudat bechira, but you move your nekudat bechira, right, in certain ways, so that certain things are no longer options for you. So I think that's part of I think the challenge about whether this is an attractive notion, which fundamentally believes that your relationship to your body is illusion, right? Right, that doesn't matter at all. What matters is right, are the ways in which you conceive of yourself and the choices you make in your mind, and your body is much less relevant. Okay, other comments about that? Steve, do you want to say something? No. Okay.
I'm good. I'm in between things right now, so I have comments afterwards when I re-listen to this. But for now, I'm
okay.
good.
Okay. Good. So now I'll shift to the one thing that I have to contribute here, which is a paragraph from the Rav. I'll put in the autobiography that, as opposed to Rav Shagar, who I would say I have mildly struggled with for some time. The Rav has mattered to me since I was a teenager, which was a frighteningly long time ago. When I was certainly before I was in college, because I remember I think that the first time I read Halacha for some reason was in a summer camp. I had the same experience that I think almost everybody else did at that point, which is I read about 4 to 5 pages of Halacha until I hit the point where there's Greek. And once I hit the point where it's Greek, in Greek letters, right, I just gave up. But before you get to the Greek, there's what's called the long footnote, which is which for many of us was like the central statement of the Rav. It's the place where the Rav, fairly sharply. First of all, a couple of things. One is so you can stop making fun of people who only know Tanakh, only Tanakh because of Gemara ritual context. The Rav talks about Psalm 23 as that song we sing at Shalosh Shudas. And he says that people who sing, he maketh me to lie down on green pastures and think that's what religion is, are completely wrong. And he's very harsh. He says, we have a word for that kind of religion. We call it Christian Science. But really for really religious people, this is an illusion. Right? Really religious people have a stormy and turbulent religious life. And in a sense, if you were the little bit I know about Rav Nachman, right? It's sort of an anti-Rav Nachman in celebrating the turbulence as opposed to seeing it as something to be to be endured and overcome. But I've always I have been reading and rereading the Rav for basically all my adult life. Had different phases. There were periods when I found when I experienced myself as rebelling against the Rav. This can't possibly be true. And then often after periods of rebelling against the Rav, I suddenly discover myself and discover that no, the Rav really meant what I thought all along, or it changes my mind. But more often, I find the Rav meant what I thought all along. We're in one of those periods now, where after a long period of struggling with the Rav about something, it turned out that the Rav always agreed with me. You could be a little bit suspicious of the, that the Rav turns out to agree with me as often as he does in the long run after we fight for a very long time. And the passage that has been the focus, really, I guess probably the text that I come back to more than any other for 30 years is the passage in which the Ish Halacha seems not to care about reality. So I want to read that passage with you. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to read that passage with you. We're going to read it in the original Hebrew. There is an official translation by Professor Kaplan that you're all welcome to read afterwards. But I want to read it to you in Hebrew, and I'll translate it as I go along because I think that gives you a better sense of how I understand it. Okay, here's what he says. When many of the ideas of halacha have no parallel in physical reality, or social reality, as it appears, right? There's just you're studying the halacha, and it has nothing to apply to. The Ish Halacha is not worried or bothered about this at all. Mas eit nafsho, right? The thing that he longs for, he lo realizatio shalacha. He doesn't yearn for making halacha actual, right? For making halacha be practiced in the physical world. Ela constructio idealich nitnala misinai. He's interested in the ideal construction that was given to him at Sinai. V'zu kayemet le'olam va'ed, and this lives, right? This endures forever, right? And he quotes Ironi Dachat by Nuga ben Esomre lo yav l'tiliot lama nichtava drosh v'kal b'schar, right? So the Gemara has those three examples. Some of you know that I spent a lot of this year writing articles and giving shiurim about the many ways in which that those positions may not represent halacha as generally understood, shall we say? But we're in the Rav's universe right now. Eini shalacha mitztaer klal l'klal al huvda sharbei yitzirot idealiyot enan mitkashmot klal l'klal. Right. So Ish Halacha has absolutely no right. There's no concern, let alone pain, about the fact, right? The fact that many ideal constructions never come to physical reality, or never meet Gashem. Kimahu Avdel Imrani Dachat Etamuduga Ben Sora Moreh Hayu Alo Hayu Atidim Leyod. What would it matter whether these halachic ideas ever come to reality or not? Yesoda Yesodot Ve'amuda Machshava Hilchatit. Right, the fundamental core ideas, and here is obviously playing off the beginning of the Rambam, right, where the Rambam talks about Yesoda Yesodot of philosophy, is that God exists. Yesoda Yesodot Ve'amuda Machshava Hilchatit is not hahora'ah l'maseh, is not practical halacha, ela kviat halacha iyunit, but rather the fixing, right? Meaning the creating, making static, right? The halacha, right? The intellectual halacha, right? Establishing what the intellectual halacha is. Leficha hishtamtu v'adayin mishtamtim mishei halacha yoter gdolim yilochahen b'chunat rabbanut b'Yisrael, right? That's why many of the greatest yishei halacha are trying to avoid the practical rabbinate, and they become fellow travelers amongst the people who are afraid of Hora. Right. So here is the Rav's apology pro vita, father or grandfather, that kind of thing. Right. That the reason they didn't issue psakim wasn't because they were afraid. Right. This is parallel to Rav Shagar's claiming that that our celebration of postmodernism should not come out of fear but celebration. They were fellow travelers among those people Yirei Hora'ah because they weren't Yirei Hora'ah, they just weren't interested in Hora'ah. And if necessity, Shelo Yuguneh, which should not be despised, compels them to act against their desires, against their wills, and to issue practical halachic rulings. This is just a small, insignificant thing. I think it's from Professor Kaplan's translation. That the Ishei Halacha don't focus on it. Halacha v'lo ha'maseh, halacha and not the action. Hayitzirah ha'ideialit v'lo ha'realit, the ideal construction and not the real construction. Miyatzeget she'ifat ba'halacha, that represents the true yearning of the Isha Halacha. Okay, and this is for those of you following along at home. This is page 31 of Isha Halacha, and it parallels page 23 to page 24 of Professor Kaplan's translation. Okay, so now the question is, what is this about? Right, what the Ish Halacha, the Rav tells you all the time, is a realistic person. So he's not going to, right? So he can't share Rav Shagar's notion that the world is an illusion. Now it's a challenge here because all the rhetoric of Ish Halacha is Platonic, and so it's very easy to suggest that, and this is what I always thought, and I think it's still true, but not as true as I thought it was, that the Ish Halacha, and is the theoretical physicist. That's what he says, right? The theoretical mathematician, who lives in a Platonic world, which believes that the physical world is just a shadow of the world of ideas. Right? So there is, in that sense, that the physical world is not reality, which is parallel. On the other hand, he never denies the significance of the choices we make in the real world. Even though it's true also that the fundamental argument of Ish Halacha in many ways is that tshuva is really important, because tshuva enables us to recognize that in the spiritual world we are free of the tyranny of causality. Right? Tshuva is an anti-causal notion, and all of Ish Halacha is about freedom. Right? Ish Halacha has true creativity, and therefore true. But here we should be here. Now here I'm going to introduce the one word that I think is the contribution I have to make the conversation. For Rav Shagar, as I understand it, and as I'm presenting in this essay, the purpose of getting past the illusion is to achieve freedom and to become Neo. And Neo has no rules at all. Right? Neo can do whatever he wants, and he controls the whole universe. For the Rav, the purpose of recognizing of overcoming the tyranny of causality is autonomy, which is not the same thing as freedom. Autonomy is the capacity to make your own rules, which is very different than the capacity to live in a world in which there are no rules. Right? The matrix ends with Neo recognizing that in the artificial world he lives in, there are no rules whatsoever. And the Isha Halacha, and this is where my latest reading of the one I came with 2 years ago of the Rav comes in. I think that the Rav argues that the Isha Halacha gets to be a participant in the making of the rules that he is bound by, because he is bound by God's rules. Right? God gives a Torah, and the Torah sets out rules, but the Isha Halacha becomes a creative partner in the construction of the rules that he lives by. Now he's not interested in halacha l'maaseh, because halacha l'maaseh is being moreh halacha l'maaseh is really telling other people what to do. And Ish Halacha is not interested in power. And so long as the decision is made, even if other people tell him what to do, as long as they're telling him what the rules that he participated in requires, that doesn't bother him at all, because he's not interested in freedom. He's interested in autonomy. He wants to live by rules that he is a partner in the creation of. So that's the idea that I wanted to put out, really, that the conversation that would happen if the Rav and Rav Shagar walked into the holodeck is whether the ultimate human goal and the sense of freedom that religion is supposed to give you, or is it really religion is supposed to give you freedom, or the religion is supposed to give you autonomy? Now, I think that the Rav would agree with Rav Shagar's critique of people who want rules because the alternative is anarchy. Right? The Rav doesn't think the alternative to freedom is anarchy. He thinks the alternative to autonomy isn't anarchy. The alternative to autonomy is tyranny. Right? And we could try and construct construct Hobbesian versions of the spiritual world as well if we wanted to. But that's the idea that I want to put out. One, right, that there's a fundamental nafkamina in their worldviews as to whether ultimately what you want is freedom or autonomy. And I want to go back to the original question, but both of them essentially move the fundamental locus of spirituality away from doing things. Right, you can imagine, right? You can imagine, their religious worlds being perfectly happy if you could somehow have freedom and just be a soul in Rav Nachman's shape, or just a mind in the Rav's world. If you could just be that would be fine, right? The problem seems to be, and it's a paradox that all such thinkers have to deal with, is that even as you say that true freedom is spiritual, there doesn't seem to be a possibility of freedom unless you're embodied. And you have to explain, so why is that? Why is freedom located with being physical, even though the irony is that it seems like the physical world is determined and the metaphysical world is not. And yet angels don't have free will in most versions, right? In most visions, right? We can go read Paradise Lost and see if we figure out why angels have free will, and you can deal with the whole philosophic notion about whether it's sensible to ask the question of whether God is either free or autonomous. But that seems to me a paradox that has to be addressed. The way in which, as I say, the two avatars, I guess you would frame that, would be Rav Tzadok, that I mentioned earlier, who believes Hakol b'yedei Shamayim chutz miyirat Shamayim means that in the real world there is no freedom at all, and yields the result that real avoda takes place only at night when you're dreaming and you're not, right, and you're not conscious, you're not making conscious choices at all. And Rav Lichtenstein has a marvelous essay that I think is the paradigm of a certain kind of Ish Halacha thinking, where Rav Lichtenstein argues that really ha'osek b'mitzvah patr min ha'mitzvah should apply, right? The theoretical position, dealing with the stira in the Rambam, that on the one hand we hold that in practice ha'osek mitzvah patr min ha'mitzvah doesn't apply to Talmud Torah, and yet in one place the Rambam says it does apply kol sheken by Talmud Torah. So they're all the halachic distinctions as to when and where. Rav Lichtenstein's understanding is that fundamentally Talmud Torah should be override all other mitzvah. It should be osek mitzvah patr min mitzvah. But there's something about the nature of Talmud Torah and the way in which we regard it that would be undermined if opportunities came to fulfill it and we didn't fulfill them. So, right? So the way Lichtenstein frames it is, it would be a chisaron in our Talmud Torah if we didn't do mitzvahs when it came up, and therefore osek mitzvah patr min mitzvah doesn't apply to Talmud Torah because it would weaken the nature of Talmud Torah if we were to say that. But ultimately, you could imagine a world, if you are a brain in a vat and you're just studying Talmud Torah all the time, and opportunities for mitzvahs never came up. So for Lichtenstein, why would you ever want to stop learning Torah? Right. So both of them, put the locus of religious life in an imaginary world, so to speak, not in the world of the mind, not in the physical world. And the question is that really a good thing? So I want to give another analogy to try and think about this, which relates to the whole Zoom question, which is about Hilchos Shabbos. So my friend Rabbi Dov Linzer and I have done a number of joint public conversations about Hilchot Shabbat and the future of Hilchot Shabbat, which you can find on YouTube. And the distinction usually comes down to this. We both agree that Hilchot Shabbat nowadays, even more so than in the time of the Gemara, are Hararim Tzluyim Basara, right? There are mountains hanging at the ends of threads, because pretty much a lot of us know that at least if you accept Rosh Shlomo Zalman, who I think is compelling, although Rav Asher Weiss has made a nice try in other ways around it, but I think he's posking like the Yerushalmi against the Bavli, which is not the way we work. Really, we don't have a basis for banning electricity on Shabbos. And so really, we could, if we wanted to, you could imagine a halacha in which Shabbos is fundamentally irrelevant in experience, right? Shabbos is no different than the rest of the week, because most of the things that matter to us are accomplished electronically. Rav Moshe was worried about this, and there's a certain extent that's true. Forget electricity on Shabbos clocks. Rav Moshe fought Shabbos clocks even though he didn't have a halachic argument against them, because he thought that the experience of Shabbos would be destroyed if we could make everything happen. We can make everything happen that way. So Rabbi Linzer sees this as an opportunity. We should start thinking about what we want Shabbos to look like experientially, because the Lamatet Melachot are probably not the way. They don't have the same social significance they did back then. And my argument is, no, we have to find a way to make the Lamatet Melachot, relevant again. We have to find a way to define them in ways that will make them relevant. And Rabbi Yisachar Katz says, the ultimate, pushing it the other way. And he says, no, what we need to do is we need to ban accomplishing the Lamatet Melachot even virtually. Right? So if you're playing a video game, you shouldn't be allowed to light a fire on the video game, because so whatever, however you live virtually, you should live virtually the way your physical body would have to live would have to live in the physical world. And so that way we've shifted our reality, but and the halacha applies now to our virtual reality and not to our actual reality. So I want to I guess and I'll turn to you and ask Rabbi Yon first. Anybody else has comments about how? So this question is coming up for anyone dealing with halacha now, right? Trying to figure out to what extent are we comfortable treating our virtual lives as real. And I think that's really, if you want to say that you can construct a minyan on Zoom. Right? I'm not dealing with the technicalities of that. I've given shiurim about this all week, and I'll give more shiurim about it next week. But suppose you're asking the question independent of technical argumentation: is it a good idea or not? And so one argument is, yeah, because that's acknowledging a very important aspect of our experience, and one which is freer. So like one of the arguments being made for Zoom minyanim is that you have a position that's in various places say that you can join a minyan even if you're in a different space. How different a space is machloket? Because you're showing your face, and showing your face is an important ideal, right? Rav Roni Neuwirth pointed out that the Aruch HaShulchan says that the svara for showing your face, making you part of minyan, is that a minyan is about hashrat shechina, and the face is the fundamental aspect of hashrat shechina, and because kikran or pnei Moshe. So now said, so so if a virtual showing of your face should be the same. And what I wondered is, but let's think about this. What if you don't have to show? Do you have to show the projection of your physical face? If this argument is really true, and that would mean that then I have there's a weakness in it that it's a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional object. But what if we say that people's real lives are online and they could use their avatars? Are people going to be willing to say that you can use if you want to work in the context of Moshe's truth, as long as the avatar mirrors your actions, right? Why does the appearance of your face? Why can't you present yourself as as younger than you are if you really feel that way? Why can't you present yourself whatever it may be? So that's right. It seems to me that we are being forced to address the question of the extent to which we think embodied reality is a central aspect of religious life, or just an accident that happens to be the way in which, for whatever reason, the world is set up to enable us to engage in freedom. But if we can abstract it, if we can find a way to get past the illusions, maybe that's better, and maybe it'd be perfectly fine if we lived in an online life. And given that, right, to what extent is it is the goal to celebrate freedom? For example, that we could say everybody can appear in the way in which they feel at that moment, right? That would be an ultimate free vision of it. Or we could say that no, we have you have to construct a new personality, but that personality has to be predictable and bound, right? And whatever you do, you have to intend it to last, and you could have much more what I would say is a Rav vision than Rav Shagar vision. Right, so those are the ideas I wanted to put out, and I'll give it to Rav Mayan now, and then I'll stay for as long as people want to make questions, right? Make comments or ask questions.
Thank you. I mean, the one big thought that I'm having is that I think that between Rabbi Nachman / Rav Shagar and Rav Soloveitchik, one of the really central issues has to do with whether you locate freedom in the realm of intellect and the realm of intellectual contemplation, sort of contemplating wisdom, like you said, the Platonic model, or in the realm of the will. And for a lot of what is in a lot of what's in Rabbi Nachman and in some parts of Rav Shagar is there's more a sense of the possibility of the absurd as being a revelation of the freedom of the will. Whereas for Rav Soloveitchik, that would be a kind of breakdown of the possibility of the freedom of autonomy, which exactly comes from being able to plug into and understand the truth of the conceptual system and conceptual reality of Torah. So, Rabbi Nachman said, for example, there was this famous, of course, there's a famous classical debate in medieval philosophy about whether God can do something which is intrinsically impossible. So can God make a triangle that has four sides or whatever? So there were a lot of rationalistic philosophers who said, well, no, God can't make a triangle that has four sides. But that doesn't take away from God's omnipotence, because it's not a lack of your omnipotence to not be able to do that which is by definition impossible. The reason I mention this example is because Rabbi Nachman is on record as specifically saying, I believe with complete faith that God can make a four-sided triangle. And there are many other parallel statements like that in Rabbi Nachman. So there's a place there where, even though of course he has lots of things about contemplation and about contemplating wisdom, it's not like that's not a theme in Rabbi Nachman, but there's this kind of rebellious sense of the possibility of how the absurd opens up a realm of freedom. And I think that's a very key thing of trying to understand how that becomes not nihilistic, which is obviously one of the things that's to be concerned about in postmodernism, but how that sense of the absurdity that is there's a close, there's a kinship between, Kafka and Rabbi Nachman, and as many people have discussed, and that kind of question of trying to understand how that absurdity can be something that opens up and someone can see as being actually nourishing for their spiritual life rather than undermining of it, is a very key issue, I would say, in general. But the other thing I would just add to that is that the sense of the absurd also has to do with a sense of humor and a sense of limitations for Rabbi Nachman. So I don't think that, in this particular story or other things in Rabbi Nachman, of course, there's lots of places where it sounds like Rabbi Nachman is talking about his almost unlimited powers. That's undeniable. Anyone who knows anything about Rabbi Nachman knows that that's very true. At the same time, there's also many, many other things where Rabbi Nachman talks about and jokes about and whatever, about all kinds of places where he ran up against all kinds of limitations. And that is not denied in the spirituality of Breslov and in the teachings of Rabbi Nachman. So I think that's really important to say. It's more like, instead of saying, well, here are these limitations, and I don't think Rabbi Nachman's worried about a deterministic universe. I don't think the world appears to him to be deterministic, but I think he is worried about a despair-inducing appearance of the universe and of life. And I think that he finds a freedom to transcend the possibility of despair, but I don't think it's about actually escaping the world or the physical or the body. It's more about escaping those things, both intellectually as much as physically, that appear to be despair-inducing or appear to cut off the possibility of hope or meaning, something like that.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot. There's an enormous amount to talk about. I hope we'll have opportunities to talk about it again. The things that I want to put in just as ways of thinking about future conversations. I think absurdity is a core part of any 19th, early 20th century philosophy. Everyone has to deal with the notion of the absurd. The question is, what is it that generates the absurdity? So for the Rav, I think it's mortality that generates absurdity. And so the Platonic worldview enables you to participate in something that is eternal, as opposed to mortal life, which is right. And I think that's, whereas I don't think it's mortality that generates the absurdity in Rav Shagar, and I don't know if it does in Rav Nachman. The other thing I would comment, this is just listening to you, right? It seems to me that the way Rav Shagar understands it, Rav Nachman feels those limits because he's not yet Mashiach, right? But the real Mashiach would have unlimited powers, and so right, acknowledging his own limitations is not the same thing as acknowledging the necessity of limitations. It just means he hasn't gotten there yet, and he's looking for Neo, and right, that's where Rav Shagar's interpretation of the story is that his son was supposed to be Neo. right? And Rav Nachman is whatever the name of the guy is who recruits Neo, and right. So I'll just put that out without any evaluation. I think that's there.
That last point is a much longer conversation. It has to do with the shift from Rabbi Nachman from the imminent messianism of the mid of like 1805 to I'm just going to tell stories which are clearly all messianic, but most of which don't end. And he's like, there's more to the story, but I'm not telling it. So one way of saying that is that you can see he's always pointing towards this place where it is going to be fulfilled. And the other way is that the messianic secret becomes the unfulfillment of the messianic secret. And I think there's a lot of evidence.
That's interesting. You probably have Ariel here for that conversation as well. I would think that Ariel would like that that interpretation. That would be my sense. Okay, terrific. Does anybody else have comments or questions that they'd like to?
Yeah, I have a question. So
Sure.
I guess like I'm thinking, how does our validation of the virtual community change the way that we treat the virtual community? Like whether or not meaning whether or not it is really real, the way that we treat it, I feel like affects the way that we might decide how to positive about it. And I guess like the thing that I'm thinking about is like for people who really need a sense of community, and for whom like I think that like not having a sense of community is affecting their mental health, like being really isolated. Like how does the halacha change if their only way of connecting to the real world is through through a virtual space, and like that kind of changes the way that they're like. I feel like for them in particular, the halacha would be different, I guess.
Okay, so let me try and take that on way too briefly, but there are things I'm glad of the question because I want to.
Totally.
Malamed, for example, right, said that virtual reality is not reality at all, but there are people who can't live in our reality the way we have it, and so halacha, right? So you're entitled as a posek. This is the way I'm interpreting him. You're entitled as a posek to pretend, right? So Malamed essentially says about Kaddish Yatom is you can say Kaddish. I'm not evaluating now. You can say Kaddish Yatom as a yachid. Just you shouldn't because it doesn't really accomplish Kedushat Hashem, but it's not really usher, and therefore, but people, it doesn't work for people psychologically if they don't think there's a minyan, even though they could say the words. Now, a virtual minyan is not really a minyan, but since they're not doing anything usher anyway, if they said it individually, why don't we pretend that it's a minyan? Right? That's essentially, as I understand it, Rav Malamed's position. Then there are other people, right? Rabbi Katz has argued that no, a virtual minyan is a real minyan, right? And up till now, if I were to extract, up to now, we've been living in the illusion that the physical bodies are what matter, but really all that matters is the connection among souls, and the connection among souls can happen without the body. Maybe it's even better because we can get rid of we can get rid of eros if we do it that way. Now there are all sorts of interesting questions that that my wife asked me, like so what's a mechitza? If you have to show your face, dafka, right? So right, so that's a whole and other people have commented, sort of self-consciously that when they daven, that when they daven in a virtual minyan, it's purely especially if they're not trying to put halachic things, so it becomes totally egalitarian, right? And that's exactly true, right? Because it enables you to ignore the factors that would require mechitza, perhaps, in a regular, right? So I think there's one attitude which celebrates the removal of spirituality from the body, and there's another attitude which says no, right? That's really the halacha is focused on our being embodied, but you know what? There are people who can't live with it. And then there's a third possibility, which is where I tend to locate myself without making any halachic positions, which is that halacha prefers us to live in a world where there are bodies, but we have to recognize right now that we're not. And then the question is, how do we acknowledge this loss, right? That we don't, that really we should be getting together, and getting together is a wholly different thing. And three-dimensional experience is and an experience where you're moving shifts the way you see other people, as opposed to on a screen where if you move around, the screen doesn't what you see on the screen doesn't change. right? As opposed to moving around the person where you see different, right, where you see different things. So is there a way in which we, in order to have halacha in the world we live in, right? This is parallel to the conversation of Linzer. So I don't want us to, say, okay, you know what? For now, right, we're going to ignore all of halacha when it comes to davening because halacha doesn't apply to the virtual world, right? So that's right. So maybe, right? I think I would, to the extent that I have a sympathy, it's the construction of an acknowledgement that as a spiritual community, we are not living embodied lives right now, even though individually we're still embodied. And and if I, so the framework that I would think about halacha in is that, in addition to what you point out correctly, is that there are lots of people who just can't live in this world, right? And halacha maybe is necessary for them in certain ways, and that's and Kaddish to me is a locus. For some people this is a golden opportunity. Kaddish has been blown out of proportion. It's been approached magically, and so the capacity to get people to understand that the proper way to give honor to the relatives or to raise the relative stature in Shemayim is to give tzedakah and learn Torah, and the mechanical recitation of something in a language you don't understand, right, once in a while is not very helpful. So some people celebrate this. Yay, we finally get to point out to people that right, that the spiritual world they've been living in is an illusion, and they have to. Right, other people are desperately sad because Kaddish has been this incredibly powerful moment, and now people can't have it. And I think that's also a great thing to struggle with.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you, Rafi.
thank you. Yeah, that helps me kind of place it also, like place the existential halachic piece into the philosophical terms. So that's helpful. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Are there other questions or comments? Okay, so I thank you, Ramayan, very much. This was fun. We talked about trying to find a way to do this more formally, and I'm glad that we got to do it. At least a first shot. Thank you, Rafi, for your contributions as well. Thank you, everyone who listened. And I haven't put out a schedule for this week yet, or for the rest, or for the future at all. But I hope that you'll pay attention to the CMTL Facebook page to look for what hopefully there will be some shurim this week. Not, I think, anywhere near as many as last week, and perhaps we'll find ways to have these particular kind of conversations in some kind of structured context, whether this week or not. Shavua tov, everybody.